When I hear that term, I think of a city that has not come to grips with itself. That there are differences, be they ethnic, economic, social, that has prevented the city from coming together as a whole so that we can work for the larger good.
When I heard those words, the first thing I think is white and black.
The word discrimination comes to my mind, like discrimination, racism, the vestiges of all of that come to my mind when I think about the word Delmar divide.
To me, it's a term that sends the message that we're not on one accord, and because we're not on one accord, we're not able to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to us as a city.
I mean, to me, what it evokes is, the other side of the tracks. People in St. Louis do tend to live, it's so segregated, they live in their bubbles. Because the number of times I've had someone say to me, oh, St. Louis never struck me as that segregated. Because of course, if you'd ever cross the line, you don't see the segregation, you just see your side of it.
For me, segregation, that's really what it is. Like, you have a white population down in the southern part because they're not part of it, and you have a black population in the north part. That's kind of what the gist of it really is. Like, you have the different groups that, don't really intermingle.
In some respects, it's like, St. Louis is caught in a time warp.
Again, you can tell that if it had been kept up, and if the money had stayed there, it would look almost exactly the same. But that investment and that care, I guess, just sort of like dried up at some point.
And at the same time, what was north of Delmar, in the eyes of many, was less than what was south.
Because there's so much concentrated wealth there in the Central West End, and these huge mansions, right, that have been kept up since the 1800s, and you get 2 blocks north, and all of a sudden it's very much tragic, for one thing. That's it doesn't have to be that way. A lot of cities have something like that, but it's not as pronounced, it's not as stark, it's not as ingrained, I think, as it is here. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but and it's tragic in that sense. It's tragic in, you see the crime, you see the poverty, you see all this stuff that's happening, north of Delmar, and you don't, those are your neighbors, you don't want that happening, right? That's it affects all of us. It's not just the folks who live up there, although they're the most directly affected by it.
I think Delmar really represents our city. St. Louis is on the hot seat. It's had so many problems, it's had so much unrest. And Delmar is right in the middle of that.
When Louis came home to the flats, he hung up his coat and his hat. He gazed all around, but no wifey he found, so he said, "Where can Flossie be at?" A note on the table he spied. He read it just once, then he cried. It ran, "Louis dear, it's too slow for me here, so I think I will go for a ride. Meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. Don't tell me the lights are shining any place but there. We will dance the hoochie coochie. I will be your tootsie wootsie if you will meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair."
Delmar is one of the few streets that runs all the way from downtown, all the way down by the river, out into St. Louis County through the suburbs.
If you look at the Delmar Divide, I think south of the Delmar population is like 73% white. North of Delmar, the population is 90% Black. And so obviously that street is uniquely kind of separates our area based on race.
Delmar is known as the sort of geographic divide between the areas of town that are majority white and the areas of town that are majority Black. And so, streetcars ran out that way. The Delmar Loop is a big sort of entertainment district where they used to have a streetcar sort of turnaround area. In a lot of places, white people in the city of St. Louis started fleeing for the suburbs. You started seeing this split start to occur in the city, but in the county also. So like I said, Delmar kind of spans the whole thing. And so over time, people sort of split both sort of self-sorting and also by virtue of institutional things that, again, sort of south of Delmar, broadly, especially in the city, broadly white or sort of mixed race, but north of Delmar, almost monolithically majority African American.
I think of economic, social ramifications as well. The home values are higher south of Delmar. The median income is higher south of Delmar. There are more social opportunities and places to go, south of Delmar. So yeah, that's the kind of things I think about when we say Delmar Divide.
So whenever you hear the word divide, it means that there's one side and the other side, but it could also mean one side versus the other side. And in this case, because you're a city of somewhat limited resources, one side of the divide is getting greater access or more resources than the other side of the divide.
I think, all you have to do is look at it. I mean, it's not something you can just talk about. You drive by and you just drive through North St. Louis and you drive through South, and you see the differences. And that's really based on development, and investment, you see there stores moving out north, lack of available medical facilities. So, it's really visual to see the difference.
Today, I think it still represents kind of and I look at more terms like central corridor. So if you think of the central corridor as being that part of the city that has the best of everything to offer, it has our cultural institutions like the Science Center, the Art Museum, the Museum of Missouri History Museum, the zoo, all those things are kind of, and Washington University, St. Louis University, all the way downtown to the Arch. That's kind of the central corridor, and I think Delmar is sort of the north side of that, if you will, and it may go as far south as Highway 44 or 64, depending on your view of the world. So even though there have been more people of color to migrate south, there's still this gap in wealth, educational achievements, even access to educational opportunities. And that probably goes more in line with economic situations, and that those families are better able to choose school experiences that are better resourced than other families. So I think whenever you begin to have a higher concentration of poverty, you're going to have a less than situation. And where there's greater access to resources and wealth, you're going to have greater investment and more opportunity. So, to me, it represents a place where over time you've had people who've been better off economically sort of concentrate where they live. And as a result of that, they've done a lot to invest in that part of their community. Whereas in the other part north, you probably had more transitions. Families, as they do better, tend to move out of those neighborhoods, and either those that population is not replaced, and so the housing stock goes down, the investment's not there. You don't have sort of community-based businesses to generate revenue, and all those things that you look to have in order for a community to thrive or for a neighborhood to thrive. So there's fewer students attending those schools that are north of Delmar, if you will. So those buildings get shut down, and what had traditionally been an anchor is now an eyesore to that community. Even if you think of churches, if you think of the migration of African Americans to North County, they generally left North City. And so those churches that they attended, or those, whatever those religious institutions and educational centers that they were part of, they're no longer there. So you've had a much larger decline in population that has not replenished itself. And so the overall quality of those communities is lesser today than perhaps it was years ago. And at the same time, what was north of Delmar, in the eyes of many, was less than what was south.
If you're driving up, say, Kings Highway or Union, and you cross Delmar, you immediately see the neighborhood change. I mean, it's just like that. As soon as you cross the street, you see, $1 million homes on one side, and then on the other side, houses that can barely appraise out to be sold on the open market. I see neighborhoods that look identical to neighborhoods in South St. Louis, like there are neighborhoods in the 27th Ward that look identical to neighborhoods in the 13th Ward. Same housing stock, you can tell it's the same builder because the houses look identical, right? But those houses in North St. Louis in the 27th or 2nd Wards appraised for at least $30,000 to $50,000 less than the same exact house in South St. Louis. And the only thing that's different is because they're on the opposite sides of Delmar, and one neighborhood is Black and one neighborhood is white. And nowhere is that more visible than, my house and my dad's house. So we live about 4 or 5 blocks north of Delmar. He's on Cates, and I'm one street over on Cavaney. And he built what should be appraised as a $500,000 home. All the bells and whistles, insulated concrete foam, a propane generator, solar panels on the roof, 3-car garage, 5 bedrooms, full basement, all of the, thousands of square feet. His home won't appraise for more than maybe $350,000, $400,000. But if you move that same home 5 blocks south, it easily goes for, I would say, $750,000, $800,000 just for sheer location. I just want to make sure that there's equity in our processes, and equity in the appraisal process. And then as we look at equity, we also have to look at just appraising those properties for the same amount isn't going to help things overnight, because there may be families in those homes who cannot afford an increase to their taxes overnight like that. But what other things can you do to make it more palatable so they're not pushed out of their homes? There was one thing I was talking to a group of activists yesterday about economic justice. And one of their plans was to freeze property taxes for seniors over 62 who had lived in their home for 10 or more years, who had also deeded their home to someone in their family. And so we talked about, some of the ins and outs about that proposal. And I said, well, I think is a good proposal. And I think Philadelphia has done some stuff related to that as well. I think that, one of the unintended consequences is if you're doing it for every 62-year-old, regardless of where they live, you could have a bunch of, expensive homes and condos come off of the tax rolls. So, if you're really trying to make sure that marginalized families hold on to their assets and are able to pass them down as generational wealth, then you might have to, put an income cap in there or a valuation cap. So it really targets the people that you're trying to help. We have to do a better job of when we do give out tax incentives. And don't get me wrong, I'm not just saying that we should just stop giving out tax incentives for big development. All of it has a place, but I think we have abused it in the last 20 years or so. And so we need to take a look at our 150 plus TIF districts and see which ones can be rolled back or take the or retired early. In my office, there was a TIF that was retired 2 years before it expired, and we were able to put back $8 million into the school district in 1 year. It's a lot of money, but it begs the question: what other TIFs are like that? We saw with Whole Foods, for example, the Whole Foods that's in the West End, that was a TIF. The guy built apartments above it. Those apartments are all rented out. He got his money back. He sold it to somebody else, got his money back and then some. But why is that TIF still there? He got his money back. So in my opinion, we need to take a really long, hard look at how we're awarding incentives, how those incentives are currently doing, and exercise any clawback provisions if we can. Because if that's going to bring back money to the city, then that's a perfect way to do it. And then invest that money in the right places.
So most of the things I've seen is sort of migration of businesses and other key community amenities sort of move out, grocery stores, access to healthcare, those types of things. Home of G. Phillips Hospital, which used to be North, is no longer there. When regional hospitals shut down, you really don't have a healthcare facility north in the city, north of Delmar. So you have to go to one of the BJC hospitals or St. Mary's or other places. And kind of along with that, you see this deterioration of housing and a rise in crime that goes along with that. So when you have sort of this abandonment of a community, and so no one to really vouch for its value, then people take advantage of that by vandalism, crime, those types of things, which doesn't bode well for the future of those communities, because it's going to take more of an investment to turn those things around. And then you can't do those things one street or one block at a time. You have to do them, in big chunks where people have to be willing to come in and make an investment. And so I think it's, important to be able to find those who are willing to do that. So, visually, what I've seen is sort of this loss of population, which has left more vacant buildings, which, over time get demolished. So you have more vacant lots, less people living there, fewer resources because you don't have income being generated there, less of a tax base because, the city takes possession of those properties and they don't generate tax. And so the city's responsibilities continue to grow, but the resources and the revenue that they need to make those happen are not there in large part. So you have a uneven sort of distribution of resources, and in those places where you do have resources, they're using those to improve And in the other areas, they're using those resources just to get by, So if I'm an alderman, I'm using that money to demolish an abandoned building, where if I'm south, I'm an alderman, I'm using that money to maybe build a new building or to enhance the exterior of an existing building. So resources ended up getting distributed or getting utilized in very different ways. And so from a physical standpoint, it's sort of actually seeing, this sort of drop in what should be available to any citizen, which is safe neighborhoods, adequate housing, access to health care, and the ability to get to the grocery store, I guess, transportation, those types of things.
I think it's more so now the economics of it. I mean, if you look at, there are no major, hospitals north. You got Barnes, you got, St. Mary's, you got St. Louis University, all the, even the, medical facilities are all south of Delmar. And you look at the biggest treasures the city has, which is Forest Park, is one of the biggest treasures they have. That's south of Delmar. And even talking about areas where, people like to go out and have a, nice meal. You're talking about the Hill, and different things like that. Even something as simple as a big hardware store, which is Home Depot. That's, the only one in the city is south. It's on South Kings Highway, And so I think it's more of an economic and social issue at this point.
Yeah, infrastructure, access to retail, no malls, no nothing. There's no malls north of Delmar. Not even in North County. Access to, certain types of restaurants, for example. There's only one major grocery chain north of Delmar, and that's a Schnucks that's on Union and Natural Bridge. And the next nearest grocery store I think is a Shop and Save a little bit further down Natural Bridge. And Shop and Save is good. Don't get me wrong. Save a Lot. I shop there too. They got great stuff, and fresh fruits and vegetables. But you have deserts. You have bank deserts, food deserts, grocery store deserts, healthy restaurant deserts. The only options for fast food are bad fast food options. And don't get me wrong, I love a burger from McDonald's, but you have, McDonald's, White Castle, but no options for healthy fast food like a bread company or the pasta joint was a Noodles and Company, or any of the places that you see healthy fast food options. And nowhere was that more evident was on election day. Every election day, I try to travel around to every a polling place in every ward. And around noon, I took a break to meet my staff for lunch, and we were in North St. Louis. There was nowhere for us to go to have a sit-down meal, about 8 of us. And the only place that we could go was McDonald's. We need to do better at creating an environment for small business, like, small business restaurants and, that offer healthy options to thrive and grow. And we just don't pay attention to people who live north of Delmar. Just yesterday, the superintendent announced that he's closing 11 schools, 7 are in North St. Louis. So, and we have to do better. And again, that's not the school district's fault. The school district is suffering from years of disinvestment in the city, and only investment in certain places south of Delmar, and for years of tax policy that has awarded tax incentives, millions of dollars in tax incentives and the school district has suffered because what's the biggest part of the education foundation formula is property taxes. 60% of our property taxes is supposed to go to the school district. Well, if you are giving out hundreds of millions of dollars in tax abatements, and there's no equity in the in real estate appraisals, and you're still redlining, there aren't a lot of property sales in North St. Louis, because I see the reports every year. So you're setting up your school district to fail.
I think it's more of a mental thing. I think that, I think you have people that are coming, young folks that are coming in now who don't think they belong south of Delmar. I think it's more generational. It's going from generation to generation. Like my dad, he was in Mill Creek. They moved north, and then I get older, I get a family, I stay north. So I think it's more as we're coming up, as generations are coming in, it's almost a known kind of, it's unconsciously, I think that there's been an unconscious thought that, south of Delmar is not for us, in a sense. There are not things catered for, maybe, different classes to do south of Delmar. So I think it was more of a mental. At this point, it's more mental. I think now it's been in place so long. People have talked about the divide for so long. I think it's affecting people and mentally that, hey, of course we all know we can all live south of Delmar. I mean, I can live anywhere, technically in St. Louis region that I want to, economic wise. But I think it's like an unconscious mental situation that we put ourselves in that tells us, hey, that's not where the area I would like to live. Even though I think more African Americans are living south, but there's a large percentage that when they're looking for somewhere to live or looking somewhere to start a family, they're not thinking in that area. It's automatically, North or North County, and definitely not South County, because I think South County is it's kind of has a reputation, whether it's right or wrong, that there, a lot of African Americans, would not rather live in the South County area.
No, I think it's an important issue, and I think when you look at the migration and some of the laws that were put in place, whether it was redlining or other things that did not allow, certain groups to move into certain communities, that had a lot to do with how things exist today. And those things can be difficult to overcome. And I think if we're not careful, we'll see that divide happen in other places.
one historian of the US West, a man named Jan Menafee, uses one particular theoretical construct to describe what happens in the West over the colonial into the early Republican period in the US when it incorporates Missouri. St. Louis especially becomes kind of the center, the metropolis, right? And you'll see people coming from across the globe to St. Louis, and then they spread out into the West. So there's a lot more kind of heterogeneity than there would be in a small town, for instance, Montana at the same time. It is more cosmopolitan in that regard. It's also a crossroads of North and South, of slavery and freedom, of multiple kinds of immigration from Ireland, etc. So all of these stories play themselves out in St. Louis. Once, the Louisiana Purchase is a done deal, and you've got explorers coming west, they begin to formalize what's an informal set of knowledges that is brought back by traders. And what was called a frontier of inclusion, or could have been described as such, becomes a frontier of exclusion. Segregation as we know it doesn't become a political reality until after the Civil War. Right. There's no need to segregate African Americans from whites when their status is quite clear. They're slaves, right? They're unfree. They're very, very subordinate. When slavery ends, though, segregation becomes a political imperative to remind people of social hierarchies. Then people become very, very interested in drawing color lines and making sure that there is no mixture of white and black in urban areas, on the job, and elsewhere. So it's after the Civil War that people become much more keenly aware of neighborhoods and where people live, and segregation, of course, becomes the rule of law in most cities, North and South, de facto, whether through Jim Crow laws or from covenants in communities in the North where there's no de facto legal segregation. But really, when slavery disappears, people think of other mechanisms, right, to differentiate between white and black and maintain those social hierarchies. And that's when strict segregation becomes the norm. And it also happens to be when lots of public culture and public consumer culture rises, and we can begin to see that manifestation much more clearly as well as we move into the modern era.
I think the thing for me that's most remarkable about segregation in St. Louis is the way in which the segregation remains pretty much the same, but the mechanism that's used to create it or enforce it keeps changing. So, in 1916, the city tries to pass a racial zoning ordinance, which says, if you're black, you can't live on this block. And then those kinds of laws are thrown out by the Supreme Court. So they use another mechanism, the race restrictive deed covenant, to do it by property. And then they lean more on zoning or on the real estate industry, or there's so many different ways it can be accomplished or sustained. And, the civil rights law of housing closes off some of those forms of discrimination, but then they just invent new ones.
In some communities, you will simply have, especially in the South where Jim Crow is more obvious, you don't need covenant communities, right? There's white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, and no one would dare violate, right, that line for a host of reasons, and they're not really shy about it. In the North, a covenant is attached to a deed, and it forbids the owner from selling their property to any one of a number of people. In the North, oftentimes you will find deeds that say you cannot sell to an Asian, an African American, or a Jew. These are categories of people that are routinely discriminated against buying in certain neighborhoods. So you'll have entire blocks of neighborhoods covered by these individual deed covenants that prohibit certain types of people to move in. This is really true in some of the early inner ring suburbs, right, that are consciously made by developers in the 19-teens and 1920s, right, when the United States begins to suburbanize. And so what begins to happen is you'll see these neighborhoods begin to develop, right? They have affinities, and people will move into places. based on covenants. In the 1930s, during the New Deal era, the federal government moved into a big way into the private home market by guaranteeing mortgages. And so that's when something called redlining comes into widespread use. And that's because the federal homeowners loan associations will not lend money to people who are in red zones of cities. And that's where there's old housing stock, high crime rates, any number of things that might threaten an investment of a new home, right? So lots of federal government loans are given to people who are moving into new developments in the suburbs. They're given to wealthy areas where the housing stock, the value is very stable or growing. And those areas that tend to be dominated by the working poor, African Americans, new immigrants, or poor whites, become effectively redlined so that there's no new investment in those areas. So you've created cities in which you're, by force or inducement, having some people move into some areas and others move into other areas. And it becomes this mutual reinforcing system in which property crimes and a host of other things get associated with certain neighborhoods and not others. There's now kind of systemic policing of certain neighborhoods and not others, and so on and so on and so forth. And this begins right in the early 20th century in the South, or in places like Missouri, where racism is much, much more on the surface because there are African Americans and whites living together, or in places in the North where covenanted communities prior to redlining tend to determine neighborhoods.
St. Louis, I think, stands out as, what we would characterize it as a border city between the North and the South. So it's similar in that respect to, say, Baltimore or Washington, D.C. And what these cities have in common is they have pretty substantial African-American populations before the first Great Migration. So that makes them unlike Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, any other, city further north. So because there's already a well-established African-American population, these cities basically get a head start on figuring out how to segregate. So, it's no coincidence that St. Louis and Baltimore are the two most notable cities to pass racial zoning ordinances. And they're the ones that are really quick off the mark in using race-restrictive deed covenants once we get in the early years of the 20th century, once the Great Migration does take hold. I think where it starts in a city like St. Louis, particularly, is that the African-American population is there in the neighborhood called the Ville. And when the Great Migration begins, there's this determination or this panic to prevent the Ville from expanding. And so that's where most of the lines are drawn, sort of in a ragged sort of donut around the existing African-American community. And then Mill Creek Valley, which is overwhelmingly sort of rental tenement housing, mostly African-American. So they knock that down, and at the same time, they build the big public housing complexes. The result is, they further isolate that population from the rest of the city, further concentrate them in one area of the city. And so the segregation, actually gets worse over time rather than getting better. I mean, in a lot of areas, you have, basically the same housing stock on both sides of Delmar. And on one side, it's worth 300,000. On the other side, it's worth 60,000. Because ultimately the view of the developers and the county leadership and the municipalities is that African-Americans don't belong in St. Louis County. And so the assumption is that they should move back into the city where, even though these are multi-generational neighborhoods. So, it's not just a matter of, having an African-American central city that whites flee over time, but when they flee and there's African-Americans out here, they kick them out, right? So, in such a way that really exaggerates those underlying patterns of segregation. Right after the Shelley versus Kramer case is decided that outlaws the enforcement of race-restrictive deed covenants, there's an explosion of incorporation and zoning, particularly in the county. And the correspondence of those civic leaders at the time make it quite clear that they saw zoning as a way of accomplishing what restrictive covenants had done. that if we restrict the land use to large lot, single family zoning, we can accomplish the same thing. For a long time, the city-county line was as hard a line of segregation as Delmar was. But, for a variety of reasons, that doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, there's no, and so it's more this, like the city-county line sort of collapsed as a line of segregation, and the African-American population sort of steadily migrating west through the county, but mostly north, but mostly north of that Delmar line. One interesting thing about those sorts of patterns of segregation is, they do a lot of damage when they're successful, but they also do a lot of damage when they fail, because then you get this sort of rapid racial transition, falling property values, and pretty tense racial politics in settings, for example, like Ferguson. Because you get to a situation in 2014 where, the city of Ferguson is 60 to 70% African American, and its police force of 60 is 90% white, and and the African Americans, who are overwhelmingly in a city like Ferguson, renters and more transitional. They're not represented on the school board the way white parents are. They're not. So you get this disjuncture between who lives in a city and who runs the city. I think in some respects, for people who weren't from St. Louis, the hard thing to wrap their head around was, Mike Brown was killed in the suburbs. How does that happen? Well, if you're from St. Louis, Ferguson's not really a suburb in the conventional sense of the term. And what I think it underscored, particularly in the county, was that the Delmar divide just keeps going, right? It doesn't stop at Skinker. It splits University City in two racially, and, everything north of it in St. Louis County, until you get pretty far west, is overwhelmingly African American. There's more African Americans that live in North County than in the city now. So that line, that north-south line of segregation, is moving west through the county. And what's interesting is almost anywhere where you see significant segregation, that segregation either creates or takes advantage of a sort of natural physical boundary. And then that boundary becomes, a marker. So it's like 110th Street in Manhattan, or, the river in Cincinnati, or, the other side of the tracks in Oklahoma City. Because you can use like a river or a busy arterial street or a railway as a way of enforcing segregation. Because, there's not too many places to cross a river or a railroad track that runs through a city. So you tend to isolate the neighborhoods from them. If I'm in a neighborhood that is near a railroad track, you face away from the track, and so does the neighborhood on the other side. You sort of orient that way. And so you reduce the opportunities for citizens from, different backgrounds or different racial groups to integrate in any sort of natural way, because you create these sort of hard boundaries. Then you can reinforce that by zoning. So you have a street like Delmar, and by zoning the frontage on Delmar as commercial, you create a busier street, and you create a street in which there's not houses facing each other across the street, right? The neighborhoods go this way instead. I mean, I think one thing that really stands out is not just the sort of, is seeing Delmar not just as a sort of black-white divide, but as an economic divide, like comparing incomes, poverty rates, unemployment rates, educational attainment, any metric. Not only are the neighborhoods north of Delmar much worse on every metric than everyone south, but they're getting worse over time. And so, the poverty rate north of Delmar has doubled since 1970, whereas, in real terms, incomes have fallen by half. And, so the pattern of segregation is roughly similar. Over 90% of the population north of Delmar is African American, but their economic position now is much worse than it was a generation ago.
Right now, the mechanism is wealth inequality, right? Since the 2008 recession, housing prices have rebounded in many urban areas and begin to reach, the pandemic has slowed things down, but it's in a lot of cities, real estate is very, very expensive. And because of the kind of systemic inequalities in wealth and inherited wealth, you don't need the covenants anymore because the price tag alone is going to statistically work to exclude large numbers of people from certain neighborhoods. And as well, the way schools are funded, a host of things tend to embed and entrench racist practices in real estate. And so while we no longer have enforceable covenants, while redlining is not necessarily a problem in terms of making communities, indelibly one color or not, market mechanisms have taken the place.
So the important thing to remember, again, going back to your Mill Creek example, 90% of the cost of clearing that land was borne by the federal government. And so, the federal government, for urban renewal and public housing and transportation, building highways and that sort of thing, poured money into cities in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. But, we don't have an urban policy now. The federal government is not providing significant aid to cities like St. Louis. Cities like St. Louis don't have the ability to raise much funds locally. The state of Missouri doesn't give a shit about the city of St. Louis. So, there's just not the resources that used to be available to, rehab entire neighborhoods, that sort of thing. So, if you walk through Northside St. Louis, you see a lot of very small scale redevelopment, one block at a time kind of thing. Can we make this stick? But, it's really tough going because there's not, the resources are just not available. In terms of the big picture is recognizing how much money and effort went into creating the segregated system and how little money and little effort is going into undoing it. And that's especially challenging in a metropolitan setting like St. Louis, which is governed by, 212 general purpose governments, because there's nothing preventing the Claytons and the Ladus of the world from continuing to sort of hoard opportunities. So I think you have to approach it as a regional problem, as something that involves, shaping policy simultaneously, not just in the city of St. Louis, but in the surrounding suburbs.
I don't know what the future is. I know that certainly it's weakening the traditional walls of segregation. What people build in its place, that's not for historians to decide. But we have some models, and in some places it works better than others. But right now, systemic income and wealth inequality is really tough to overcome. You're going to replicate segregated systems because wealth is segregated.
Well, it depends. I'm a glass half full guy. So when I hear Delmar divide, I think opportunity, and that opportunity is to unite. Whatever the factions are, whatever that division is, this is a chance to bring those things together in order to create a better living environment, a higher level of vitality to our living environment in the St. Louis community, which will in turn attract people to the city or back to the city. So, opportunity comes to mind. Now, if I was a glass half empty person, I would, I would probably look at it more as a reason not to invest in St. Louis. And in fact, if I'm a young person and I see that kind of division, my thinking is, well, perhaps maybe I should move to another community where, at least people know how to get along and how to cooperate.
I mean, this, it's the $64,000 question. And the big challenge is to reclaim and rehabilitate neighborhoods for the benefit of the people who live there, like not in such a way that moves them out. It's very hard to come up with policies that are genuinely, as I say, for the benefit of people who already live in neighborhoods. There are people doing it. There's a group in St. Louis called the Vacancy Collaborative, which is doing a lot of work trying to get people to stay in their homes and to do that sort of block by block rehabilitation. They're very inventive in using, packaging together different kinds of tax credits to save pockets of housing, allow people to stay in their houses. And the thing is, it's not just white parent or prospective homeowners or prospective renters who might have a dim view of north of Delmar. It's everybody. And it's not just, white homeowners and white renters that view, the Ledoux's and the Claytons they become sort of universally accepted views. And in some respects, sort of self-fulfilling views, right? If you say, that's a poor and crime-ridden neighborhood, we shouldn't go there, then you don't go there, and it has no chance of rebounding, and its schools close, and it becomes more crime-ridden. And so it's, the idea, and it goes back to the idea, from the early years of or decades of the 20th century, that African-American occupancy destroys property values, that becomes this sort of self-fulfilling thought process. And what it does is it sort of psychologically shifts the emphasis from sort of outright racism, I don't want to live next to Black people, to this sort of subtler, psychological mindset where it's like, well, I really want to go somewhere where the schools are good. And that really is code for, a bunch of big single family houses, lots of resources for the schools, schools that don't have metal detectors at the doors, that sort of thing. Another way to look at that is to recognize that, African-American families who have left North St. Louis, because there's a huge Black flight out of North St. Louis into North County, they left for exactly the same reasons that white parents left a generation earlier, right? Because the city was failing them, whether it was the schools or the crime or whatever. And so, it's not just white parents that have aspirations that their kids be safe and go to good schools and live in safe neighborhoods. But a big part of that is you have to have the infrastructure in the neighborhood, not just the houses, but if you want families to move in, you got to have schools, and you got to have decent schools. And so at the same time as groups like the Vacancy Collaborative are trying to save neighborhoods, the school district is busy closing schools north of Delmar. So you really have to be, all on the same page in terms of making those investments.
We can't change all that every state, but we can start to make it more fun in St. Louis, more human in St. Louis. And I think erasing the Delmar divide, by little, building by building, effort by effort, all the way downtown to Ballpark Village or however far it goes, will start to make people feel differently. And then one by one, we'll start fixing them north of Delmar, just, all the things that are north as well. It'll be safer and safer and safer. And we have to find housing for people who need affordable housing. The Delmar Divine is a real estate multi-use retail project repurposing a historic hospital into a 21st century place of caring, which will feature offices for nonprofits that are affordable, apartments for young, diverse professionals, teachers, nurses, social workers, those young people that make those salaries of 35 to 55 out of college and want to live in a cool place and don't necessarily want to live with 100 roommates. And then phase 3 was the former nursing school. So it's outfitted like a school. So it could actually be converted into a school. And one of my dreams is to create the quintessential early childhood center in St. Louis. But we'll see what the public demand is. And in our project also is a small part of retail. So on the front floor of the Delmar apartments, the residences at Delmar Divine is space for 3 retail tenants. One is going to be a bank, one is going to be a pharmacy, and the other is TBD. But on the side, off the parking lot, we have a space for a cafe, and we're working with a very exciting restaurant developer to bring something to St. Louis that isn't really here in any significant way, which I think is one of the most, and another restaurant that might also include a cooking school with it in a low-rise building that we have. But I think what that will do is bring people really across that invisible wall because they'll want to come to the restaurant. They'll want to come to, and food is always a part of economic development. Like if you remember it in Tower Grove, how many restaurants there are on Tower Grove Avenue and in Maplewood on Manchester Road that weren't there 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And those restaurants bring people, strangers, to come and have dinner together and say, oh, wow, maybe I'll put it off one of my businesses here. Or maybe my son wants to be in the restaurant business. Maybe he'll come here or whatever. There's a whole bunch of possibilities that come from that one step of having a restaurant that people want to come to. This location is Hollywood and Vine of St. Louis. We actually don't have to put in any infrastructure whatsoever. We're between 2 subway stops. We're between on the Delmar bus line, the trolley, and we're half a mile from Forest Park. You couldn't ask for a better location. So this area has tremendous potential. And instead of being a wall, you'll be able to see through it and walk across it either direction. Already, on Delmar and Belt, they opened up. They always have those big dividers. Those round balls, or they close it. They opened up the gates. It's the first time in decades they've opened up the gates. So people are starting to feel like we can't close off people anymore. We've got to open up the doors. And this all has come from the kind of investment that's coming to the neighborhood. I think everybody's feeling safer. It's just really ready to happen. And all of those things in one building, one campus, it's not one building, it's multiple buildings, really allows us to put a lot of creativity right from the beginning that people will be able to see instantly what's possible. And then there's other developments coming up east of us on Delmar, and then also south on de Bolivar, which all just comes together in a really nice way. The other part about it, the part that's really important to me is that it no longer be a dividing line, that it makes people, there's things on both sides of the street that people want to go to. People that are afraid from the north side of the street that don't want to move, don't normally go outside their neighborhood because they don't want to be arrested or, look like they don't belong. And the other way where people will come from the other neighborhoods, including, who knows, West County, to come to a restaurant and to come to the bank and because the pharmacy is catering to the Black consumer like they've never been catered to before. I think people will come from all over or order their prescriptions for delivery or see it as something that really stands up for the customer care that they want and deserve. They've never had from Walgreens or CVS or any other local pharmacy if there was such a thing. Since we started our project in 2015, started the idea of it and started raising the money to do it, there are many more projects now. So there's all the de Bolivar, which wasn't even thought of then because when the train station, the metro station got so dangerous, they decided they had to redo it. And then they decided to redo the whole street because it would make it more, livable. So now they're doing that. Kevin Bryant, who's doing a project east of us. Jim McKelvey did the project just east of us. So you'll have a whole swath of Delmar that is not just Delmar, but some behind the streets also. Our project goes all the way to Enright. And if we have our way, we're going to fix the park up and do some other things in the neighborhood eventually. But the idea is really to make it more livable, so more people come in, more people buy property and want to build a house on it. There's lots of houses that have been torn down. There's lots of houses that can still be remodeled. There's lots of houses that are just perfectly fine that people have been hoping to sell or repair, and they can't even get a home improvement loan because the valuation of the property is so low. So I'm a big thinker. I'm not a small thinker. This is nearly 500,000 square feet. That's a lot of square footage, and it's taking a lot of money. But you got to start somewhere. So I think we have to go big, and big is relative, but you have to start somewhere, and then you bring other people with you. So I would say that from the DeBoliver at Forest Park to our project, all the way down the street to Delmar downtown, and the Kingsway project that Kevin Bryant's doing goes a little farther north into, it's not really north, but into Fountain Park, which is a beautiful old neighborhood. There's probably $250, $300 million of investment right there in those blocks of Delmar. And that's huge. That means jobs. That means, buildings, resources, amenities that'll be built that people can walk to, they can go to, they can use. They're going to have a UPS store. They're going to all these things we've never had in these neighborhoods before. And I think that makes people say, gee, I think I'll open a business now over there. Because look at all the new office buildings. They're not new. They're just renovated, but they're totally renovated. So they feel new. But, everything's been blocked up, boarded up for decades. The stuff that we have in St. Louis is decades old and awful, and it deteriorates. And one of the things about, you might do some research on this in school, low income tax credits for building low income housing, they expire after a certain while. And then you just let the place rot, or you sell it to somebody who doesn't even care. And that's the other challenge. Even in Canfield Green, where Michael Brown was killed, those used to be nice apartments when they were first started. They were nice. They had a swimming pool. They had basketball courts. They took all that down. They closed up the swimming pool. They closed up the clubhouse. They took all those amenities away because they didn't want to invest any money in making them better, even though over the course of a lifetime, they would deteriorate. And that's wrong. I mean, why would you treat these people any differently? How do they ever come out of, and most people just lived there while they were young and got married and didn't have a great job yet. And then they moved just like a lot of people do. Oh, just seeing these places nobody should live in a place like that, not even a prisoner. And that is, that's just what we're trying to change, is make it available, more and more things available to more people, and invest. If we'd done it all along and invested in all these neighborhoods, they wouldn't be so deteriorated. But it's happening. It just didn't get started till a long time. And now we're started. Now, how do we keep it going? One by one, 1 + 1 + 1 = a million in this case. They're going to happen all about the same time, even though they weren't necessarily started at the same time. Because my project is so big, it took a lot more money, but others are smaller and they still take money. But Kevin Bryant's a Black man. He's been able to do this project. Jim McKelvey, he didn't have to ask anybody for money. I did. I had a lot of money to put in it, but I also had to ask for a lot of money. So it's just really, it's coming together, I think, the way it should, slowly but surely. It should have been faster. It should have been earlier, but we can't go backwards. We have to just move forward.
I think, I think there are a couple of ways. Private industry, obviously, with Maxine Clark and other businesses making an investment in that community. Even local government. So if you have an alderman or alderwomen who are working for their constituents, part of my responsibility is to take care of that geographical, those things within that boundary. But there's nothing that says that I can't connect to the others that surround me on each side to talk about how do we create better experiences for everybody. And whatever resources we're getting individually, we can get those collectively and have greater good, if you will. So I think part of bringing some healing or bringing some unity to that divide is to kind of reach across that divide and join in with others and say, hey, what does it take for us to make some improvements? And I think that's a big part of it. Educationally, I know it's tough to build school buildings, particularly when you have a dwindling enrollment. When I was a student in St. Louis Public Schools, we had about 100,000 students. They're less than 25,000 now. So, where are those kids going to come from? Maybe you continue to transfer kids, but maybe you build better buildings and put them in those and figure out a way to, address the vacant buildings, which I think is a big issue. So I think it takes collective thinking. I think it takes more of a universal approach. And I think just like you have people that operate within a political boundary, I think you have to make the entire St. Louis city, and both city and county, I guess, if you think about the effort to bring the city and county together, you have to look at it from take a more of a universal approach to it, knowing that if a neighborhood fails, that contributes to the overall downfall of the city. So, our effort, there needs to be more of a comprehensive approach to addressing those issues, kind of, reaching across the aisle, if you will, in order to do something that's going to benefit the greater part of the population. And I think when you have that kind of investment, when you have those kinds of improvements, then you can begin to attack other things like crime. I mean, you don't wait to attack crime, but I think you have you're sort of addressing it from both ends. You have law enforcement, but also you're creating safer environments, and you're getting rid of situations where crime is likely to take place by building up those areas. So I guess to sum it up, I'd say a universal or more comprehensive approach to addressing all the elements of the city and ensuring that you might need a new road in this part of the city, but this other part of the city might need new housing. So I think you have to kind of look and see what's best overall and begin to make your investments that way. Sounds a little simple, but in my mind, it's the kind of thing that would work.
Yeah, I think making sure everything is equally distributed, at least equally distributed. I think for years that has not happened. I mean, if you look at a lot of the investments and focus has been mainly downtown and central. Those were the biggest focuses of St. Louis development. And you look at Forest Park, all the work that was done to Forest Park over a few years. Like I say, you look at the Bourne's district over there now. They're building some unbelievable buildings now, for housing and different things. You look at Ballpark Village, downtown, and just Washington Avenue, and all those different areas. That's been the big push. And I think now, there needs to be a concerted effort to take that sort of investment, like you have going on with the NGA project, which definitely is going to help. With a project that's massive. I think you have to do these massive projects. I think the little nickel and dime, few blocks here, few blocks there, that approach is I think we're way beyond that. I think the NGA / Paul McKee project that's going on is some of the type of massive development that needs to be done in order to try to even this out. So I do have hope. I do see there are a lot of things that are going on. I just think for years that focus was, again, placed on downtown, placed south. I mean, you look at the political leaders now. I think if you just listen to their talking points and positions, people are now making sure North County is particularly county government has really, I think, kind of focused more on North County, particularly with the pandemic, has really kind of opened up a lot of deficiencies and disparities between North County and South County and West County. And so I think the pandemic has forced leaders to really look at North County and make sure that we get our resources. With the new leadership potentially coming, there's a big election for mayor's race in St. Louis in March. And I think that's going to be the pivotal moment, depending on who's elected. I think that new mayor will then put more of a focus on the areas that need attention in the St. Louis area.
It has to happen at the top. Leadership has to recognize that this is a problem and make the right decisions to steer investment that way. And we just haven't seen that. And then also, we have to, I was talking about this morning on Twitter about the school district. I said, this is a direct result of years of disinvestment. If we don't change the city into a place where people want to move to, we'll continue to close schools, we'll continue to lose population. So we have to do the hard work of making places that were not invested in for years, places that will be invested in, and bring the right types of infrastructure there where people want to live there. Of course, nobody's gonna say, well, I want to live in a neighborhood that's full of crime and where I hear gunshots every night, and where the local school is closed because the school district is losing population. Nobody's going to want to do that, but they will if you say this is a multi-year, multi-million-dollar targeted investment in this community, and we want you to come and help us build or rebuild this community. Then that makes a difference.
I think she's a great candidate. I think she, there's no perfect in our political figures for sure. And even a good, really good person with liberal and progressive views can't just snap their fingers and make things happen. But I know she has a focus on it. I know she cares about it, and that she's the lived experience person. She knows what's necessary. So she's going to put a focus on North St. Louis, I believe, north of Delmar. But she has a lot of work to do. It's a complicated city with this money that's coming from the government, because we are one of the poorest cities in the country, is significant, and she has to allocate it properly. She's got the jail that has all those problems, the workhouse that has the problems, the police force is understaffed. If you didn't, you don't have to take any money away from them. They're 150 or 200 people short. Maybe it's 250. That alone is money that is already cut, is already not being spent. So we do need police officers, and that's another story. How it works in St. Louis, or whether you can live in the city or not live in the city. How complicated it is to be a policeman. I mean, I think about it. All the stories we see on the news every day. I think about, what kind of person are they recruiting to be a police officer when they treat people like this? And why would you, such a nice human being, want to be a policeman? So I do think they need other resources like social workers and counselors working alongside them, being their partner in the car with them to help, in a case when they can mitigate. They're often called to the scene of a crime too late, but before the crime, it's possible to do a better job.
I mean, we could even talk about, how policing is different. I think policing is definitely different, based on the divide. I mean, I think if you come north, I think if, there's more of a heavy-handed approach, which I think, at some point, sometimes maybe that is, necessary, unfortunately. But I think, just over the years, that's been the approach, and that's kind of hurt relationships between citizens and police, as we see what's been going on the last, 6-7 years that stem from the Michael Brown incident. That also kind of has exposed the difference of, the policing between the divide, versus, how, people who are living south of Delmar are policed much different than the people who live north of Delmar. So I think policing is a big issue too, of trying to help making sure that divide is kind of erased. And I do think there's a big project actually in the Delmar, just north of it. There's a big project taking place at the old regional hospital, and with a lot of housing development, different things like that. So there's some things going on that I feel hopeful about, but it's just taking some time to get to this point.